The kitchen light stays on longer than planned. A small stack of bowls waits by the sink, still warm from dinner. Someone has already asked for help twice, and the evening is not finished. Hands move without much thought, rinsing, wiping, placing things back where they belong. The room holds familiar sounds: water running, a chair shifting, a door closing somewhere down the hall. It feels ordinary enough to disappear while it is happening. There is a quiet sense of being relied on in these moments. Not praised, not noticed, just expected, like the light switch or the key by the door. The clock advances, steady and unconcerned. Outside, the window reflects the room instead of the dark. Inside, the air carries the weight of a day that has already asked a lot. The bowls dry slowly, nothing calls for attention right now, at least not loudly. It waits quietly. Morning comes before anyone is ready for it. The kettle clicks on out of habit, not decision. Light slips through the curtain in a thin, familiar way, landing on the same counter it always does. There are voices before full sentences, requests before greetings. Someone needs help finding a shoe that was right there yesterday. Someone else asks a question already answered, and then asks again, softer this time. The body moves into its roles without ceremony. Hands pour, stir, wipe, reach. The rhythm is practiced, almost kind to itself, even when the chest feels a little tight. Breakfast happens in fragments. A few bites taken standing up. A plate pushed aside to free space for a backpack zipper that will not cooperate. The clock keeps its own counsel. It does not care how many things are happening at once. It keeps moving, even while someone pauses to listen for a sound from the other room. Being needed fills the air early. It has weight, but also shape. It presses gently at first, then settles in, like a coat that cannot be taken off yet. There is no single request that feels heavy. It is the layering that does it. One small need resting on another, then another, until the body forgets where it started. The words used are familiar and efficient. Just a second. Hold on. I'll help you in a minute. They come out without irritation, without warmth either. They come out because they always have. They land where they need to land and disappear. Someone looks up briefly, eyes scanning for confirmation, then moves on. The exchange is complete without ceremony. Nothing lingers long enough to be named. Being seen is not part of the transaction. It is not missing exactly. It simply does not arrive. The morning asks for presence in pieces. A glance here. A hand there. There is no single moment that says, stay. There is only momentum. And momentum carries everything forward, whether it is ready or not. Outside, a car door shuts. Inside, a chair is pushed back into place. The space left behind still holds the warmth of bodies that have already moved on. A quiet follows, but it is not rest yet. It is the pause between one set of needs and the next. It hums softly, like an appliance left on in another room. The body notices the silence before the mind does. Shoulders drop a fraction. Breath moves a little deeper without being told. There is a cup of coffee that has gone untouched. It waits on the counter, cooling. Steam is gone now, but the smell remains. This is often where the day could shift. Not dramatically. Just enough to be noticed later, if at all. But the habit of being needed does not release easily. Even in quiet, it stays alert. Listening for the next call, the next sound that means someone else cannot proceed alone. The room looks the same as it did an hour ago. Nothing marks the effort that moved through it. Surfaces are clear, floors swept, objects returned to their places. There is no trace of how many times attention was divided. No record of how often the self was set aside. The room does not remember. The body does, though not loudly. It holds a mild ache, easy to ignore. It stands still for a moment longer than necessary. A breath comes in and out. Another follows. The day waits, patient and unremarkable. The kettle clicks off again, forgotten. The sound is small, almost apologetic. It is the only thing in the room asking for attention now. Later, the day rearranges itself into smaller rooms. A hallway crossed too many times to count. A table cleared, then used again, then cleared once more. There are questions that arrive without edges. They float into the room and wait. They assume an answer will come, because it always does. The body answers first. A nod. A hand reaching out to steady something already falling. Words follow when needed. They are gentle enough. They do their job and move on. Being needed carries a certain intimacy. It means someone trusts the space you occupy. It means they do not hesitate before calling your name. That trust is real. It lives in the way footsteps come toward you without knocking. It shows up in the way silence feels safe around you. And still, there is a thin place underneath it. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just thin enough to notice when the day slows for half a breath. A place where something else might land, if it had permission. The phone lights up briefly, then goes dark again. A message that can wait. Almost everything can wait, except the next request already forming nearby. Someone needs help with something small. It takes less than a minute. It takes a little more than that. The body bends, reaches, adjusts. It knows these movements well. It learned them by repetition, not instruction. Time passes in usefulness. Hours marked not by clocks, but by completed tasks. Each one tidy, each one finite. What is harder to mark is what does not get completed. The thought that starts, then dissolves. The feeling that arrives, then steps aside. Being seen would require a pause. Not a big one. Just enough to notice the person doing the noticing. But the day does not ask for that. It asks for continuation. And continuation is something the body knows how to give. There is a moment at the sink again. Hands under running water. The sound steady, almost comforting. Reflections blur on the surface. Face indistinct. Features softened by motion and light. It is not a question of wanting attention. That word feels too sharp here. Too demanding. It is more like wanting to be held in the same way others are held. Without asking. Without explanation. Someone calls from another room. The voice is familiar, untroubled. It carries expectation, not urgency. The body responds immediately. It always has. It always will, until it does not. In between, there are seconds that belong to no one else. They appear unexpectedly. They disappear just as quickly. A breath taken near a window. A glance at the sky, pale and undecided. A thought that almost finishes itself. Then footsteps again. The house never fully empties of sound. Even quiet here is shared. Being needed shapes the hours gently but firmly. It tells the day where to go next. It leaves little space for wondering how it feels to be here, not unhappy. Not grateful either. Just present, in a way that asks very little and gives a lot. The body adjusts once more. A shoulder rolls. The neck stretches without instruction. There is no complaint in the movement. Only maintenance. Only the quiet wish to keep going without losing something unnamed. The room settles again. Objects return to stillness. The day continues, unremarkable and full. Afternoon softens the edges of the house. Light shifts across the floor, slower now. The pace loosens, though nothing officially stops. There is laundry waiting, folded halfway. Clothes rest in uneven stacks, paused mid-intention. The fabric still holds warmth from the dryer. This part of the day does not announce itself. It arrives quietly, between obligations. It feels less watched. A window is opened a few inches. Air moves through without purpose. The room exhales. For a moment, there is no one asking anything. No voices calling from another space. No footsteps approaching with expectation. The body notices this absence immediately. Not as relief exactly. More like a widening. Hands slow down. Movements stretch out, unhurried. Each action takes the time it takes. The folded clothes wait patiently. They do not mind being unfinished. They seem content just being there. Being needed recedes slightly here. It does not leave. It sits down nearby. In this quieter pocket, other sensations surface. The hum of the refrigerator. The distant sound of traffic, softened by walls. A chair is pulled out, then pushed back in. Standing feels easier than deciding where to sit. The body hovers between tasks. There is a feeling that could almost speak. It does not form words. It stays as weight, gentle and vague. Being seen might look like this. Not attention directed toward you, but space that does not rush past. The mirror catches a clearer reflection now. Lines around the eyes visible, familiar. They look earned, not dramatic. There is no need to interpret them. They are simply there. Like everything else in the room. Time loosens its grip further. Minutes stretch, then dissolve. The clock ticks, but quietly. A memory surfaces without effort. Nothing important. Just a similar afternoon years ago, light falling the same way. Back then, the roles were different. The body younger, quicker to respond. The feeling of being needed already present, already forming. It has been growing quietly all this time. Layer by layer. So slowly it feels like part of the body itself. In the stillness, that growth becomes visible. Not heavy. Just noticeable. There is a kindness in noticing without naming. Without deciding what it means. Without planning what comes next. A glass of water is poured and set down. Condensation forms along the sides. A small, precise detail. The body drinks slowly. Thirst had been there longer than realized. It eases without comment. Outside, clouds drift with no concern for schedules. Inside, the room holds steady. Nothing presses forward right now. Being needed waits at the edges. It will return soon enough. It always does, but for this stretch of time, the space belongs to no one else. It does not demand usefulness. It allows presence without performance. The folded clothes remain unfinished. Light continues its slow movement. The afternoon deepens quietly. There is no conclusion here. Just the feeling of standing in a room that allows you to be exactly where you are. Evening begins without ceremony. Light turns warmer, then thinner. The house adjusts its posture almost on its own. Sounds return one by one. A door opening. Shoes dropped near, but not quite on, the mat. The quiet from earlier does not vanish. It retreats, but it stays reachable. Like a room left open down the hall. There is movement again, familiar and expected. Bags set down. Jackets hung, or half-hung. Voices fill the space unevenly. Some carry stories. Some carry nothing at all, just noise. Being needed steps back into the center. Not forcefully. More like something resuming its place. Questions arrive wrapped in tiredness now. What is for dinner? Where something was last seen. The answers come easily. They always have. They require very little thought. Hands return to tasks learned long ago. Chopping? Stirring. The rhythm is comforting in its predictability. It gives the body somewhere to stand. It asks only that it continue. Steam rises, fogging the window briefly. The outside disappears, then comes back. Inside feels contained, held. There is a moment when everyone is nearby. Not together exactly. Just within the same few rooms. This closeness has weight. It presses gently, warmly. It asks for steadiness. Being seen could happen here. In the shared air. In the way movements do not need explanation. But the evening keeps its pace. There is little room for stopping. Food waits, hunger waits, time waits. Plates are set out. One is different, always. No one comments. The table fills, then empties again. Conversation overlaps, then thins. Someone leaves early, someone stays longer. Throughout it all, the body remains available. Listening while wiping. Answering while clearing. Being needed feels most complete here. It has purpose. It has direction. It also leaves very little behind. Once the task is done, it is done. No trace remains. The sink fills again. Water runs. The sound smooths the edges of the room. Reflections return in broken pieces. A face. A shoulder. Nothing demands interpretation. Everything simply continues. The body keeps pace without complaint. There is tiredness now, but it is ordinary. It belongs here. It does not ask to be fixed. A chair is pulled back slightly, then pushed in. Someone says thank you, distracted. It lands lightly, then passes. Being seen is not absent. It just arrives differently. In fragments, easily missed. The room settles as dishes are stacked. Lights dim one by one. The evening folds inward. There is a brief pause near the counter. Hands resting flat on the surface. The coolness grounding. This pause is small. It goes unnoticed by others. It does not announce itself. But it is there. Holding the day together quietly. Allowing the body to remain where it is, for one breath longer. Night arrives unevenly. Some rooms accept it sooner than others. Corners darken while the kitchen light stays on. The house quiets in layers. One voice drops away. Then another. Doors close softly, or not at all. A hallway light remains on longer than needed. Its glow spills into the edges of sleep. The body moves through these moments with care. Steps slower now. Hands more deliberate. There is less asking at night. Needs arrive wrapped in whispers. They hesitate before reaching out. A blanket is adjusted. A glass of water placed within reach. The gestures are smaller, but they carry more weight. Being needed changes shape here. It becomes protective. It watches instead of directs. The room holds a different stillness. Not absence. Just a gentler presence. A child's breathing settles into rhythm. It fills the space quietly. It asks for nothing else. The body stays nearby longer than necessary. Not out of duty. Out of something softer. This is where being seen almost happens. Not through words. Through staying. The light is dimmed further. The edge of the bed creaks slightly. Everything seems to listen. There is a mirror again, briefly. A face half lit, half gone. Eyes tired, but steady. No one is looking at this face right now. It exists without witness. It exists anyway. The hallway feels longer at night. Footsteps echo more than expected. Each sound has space around it. In this space, the day loosens its grip. Tasks release their hold. Expectations soften. Being needed retreats to the background. It remains alert, but quieter. It no longer fills the entire room. There is a chair by the window. It holds its shape patiently. Sitting feels optional. Outside, the dark settles fully. Inside, lights are lowered one by one. The house exhales. A thought appears, uninvited. It does not demand attention. It simply passes through. What it asks for is unclear. Not rest exactly. Not recognition. Perhaps just this. Standing in a dim room. Feeling the day settle without commentary. The body notices its own weight now. Feet against the floor. Back against the wall. These sensations were always there. They were just quieter. Waiting. A small sound from another room. Someone shifting in sleep. The body listens, then relaxes. Being needed remains possible. It always will. But it is not required in this moment. The room allows this pause. It does not rush the next step. It holds. The hallway light is finally turned off. Darkness fills the space evenly. Nothing is left out. For a few breaths, there is no role to perform. No response required. Just the body, present and intact. The night continues on its own. The house settles deeper. Silence gathers gently. The house holds its breath differently after midnight. Not silent. Just less expectant. The refrigerator hums steadily. A distant car passes, then disappears. Nothing inside the walls reacts. This is the hour where being needed loosens its grip the most. Not because it is gone. Because it is sleeping. The body moves carefully, as if sound has weight now. Floorboards are memorized. Hands know which switches to avoid. A glass is rinsed and set upside down. The sound is brief. It fades quickly. There is a chair pulled out in the dark. Sitting happens without thought. The body chooses rest before the mind catches up. In this stillness, roles blur. Caregiver? Organizer. They soften at the edges. They do not disappear. They rest nearby. The face feels different when no one is looking. Muscles release without instruction. The jaw loosens. Being seen is irrelevant here. There is no audience. No response waiting. The room does not ask who you are. It does not require explanation. It simply contains. A clock glows faintly across the room. The numbers move forward without comment. Time feels less personal. Breath becomes the most noticeable thing. In. Out. It has been doing this all day. All night. It has not asked for acknowledgement. There is a memory of earlier years. Not specific. Just the sense of another night, another chair, another quiet. Back then, being needed felt sharper. More urgent. It cut through everything else. Now it feels woven in. Part of the structure. Something the body carries without gripping. In the dark, this difference becomes clear. Not as loss. As texture. The room feels larger without light. Edges dissolve. The ceiling lifts slightly. Being unseen is not lonely here. It is neutral. It allows the body to settle where it is. A sound from outside startles briefly. Then passes. Nothing follows. The body notices how tired it actually is. Not dramatic. Just honest. There is no wish attached to this tiredness. No demand. It simply exists. Being needed will return with morning. It always does. The body knows this. For now, there is permission to stop reaching. To stop anticipating. To stop preparing. The chair supports without comment. The floor holds steady. The walls remain. There is a moment where thought slows enough to disappear. Not sleep. Just absence. In that absence, something quiet remains. Not a feeling that can be named. Not an idea. Just presence. Unremarkable. Whole. The body stays here a little longer than planned. Time allows it. Nothing interrupts. Eventually, standing happens again. The chair is pushed back carefully. The room does not protest. Lights remain off. The path to bed is familiar. It does not require attention. Being needed waits for morning. Being seen does not enter the question. The night accepts both, without comment. The bedroom is darker than expected. The curtains hold the streetlight back just enough. The bed waits without asking anything. Shoes are set side by side. Clothes folded loosely over a chair. The day is placed down in small, careful motions. The body settles under the covers. not collapsing. Just arriving. There is a sound from another room. A sigh. Then nothing. Being needed feels far away now. Not gone. Just resting somewhere else. Being seen does not come up. There is no space for it here. There does not need to be. The ceiling is barely visible. Shadows move slowly as a car passes outside. Then they are gone. Breath finds its own pace. No effort. No adjustment. The mind drifts, then pauses. Thoughts loosen their grip. They fall away without resistance. The body remembers this position. It has been here many nights before. It knows how to stay. Somewhere, a clock marks the hour. The sound is faint. Easy to ignore. Nothing waits to be answered. Nothing needs to be held together. The night carries itself. Sleep does not arrive all at once. It approaches quietly. It takes its time. The room remains. The bed remains. The body remains. And for now, that is enough.